Port is naturally sweet. The grapes are picked, crushed, and a fermentation begins as it would do for any other wine. The yeasts begin to turn the sugars from the grapes into alcohol. But before that fermentation is complete, grape spirit is added. This raises the alcoholic content beyond the point at which the yeasts can operate, so they shut down and the fermentation stops. That leaves naturally occurring grape sugars unfermented, and therefore you have a sweet drink. Port divides into two basic families: Ruby Port and Tawny Port. Ruby Port are vintage ports, vintage character, late bottle vintage, standard ruby, tend to be aged in bottle, and Tawny Ports tend to be aged in cask. Tawny Ports are excellent for nibbling at over the course of a few days or a week. You don't have to consume them all one sitting. Because they've been sat in cask, they're used to seeing a little bit of oxygen around, and therefore they're not shocked when you open the bottle. They tend also not to need decanting, because they've been in cask for so long that when they were bottled, the sediment was left behind in the cask. You'll find Tawny Ports labelled with a stated age, 10 year, 20 year, 30 year, and you'll also find Tawny Ports labelled Colheita, which is the Portuguese word for vintage. Can't use the English word for vintage because that relates to vintage ports, which are part of the other side of the family. On the back of a bottle of Colheita, you will have a bottling date. So on the front it'll tell you which vintage the wine grapes came from, and on the back it'll tell you when it was bottled, and you can work out how old and how long it's been in a cask by the difference between the two dates. The other side of the family, Ruby Ports, include vintage port from declared vintages, usually 3 or 4 every decade. These are the top vintages where the producers have pretty universally regarded the harvest to have been of sufficient quality to make a fully declared vintage port. These need a lot of time to age, to become drinkable. They also have sediment, so they need to be decanted before you can drink them. If you want the vintage port experience, but you don't want the vintage port price, try single quinta vintage ports. These are from less fashionable years, but come from the producer's top property. Still need to be decanted and give you the experience for a significantly lower price than full vintage port. You can also look out for late bottle vintage, standard ruby, various other incarnations of ports. The final mention is for white port. There are a few white grapes grown in the Douro Valley. Mostly they get put into the standard red ports, but some producers take a few to one side and make a white port. It's usually drunk as an aperitif. It can be anything from very dry to reasonably sweet, all things being relative. Some things you need to drink white port with things like some salted almonds or some crisps as an aperitif with a slice of lemon, maybe a splash of tonic, something like that.